are Bad Blue, the Goldfields Riots of 1934 in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia.
Our dad, even though he was a naturalised citizen, was an Italian, and we were worried because that seemed to be the people that they were against.
Well, I was only about 10 or 11 at the time, but it's very vivid in my mind because I think it was one of the most horrific experiences I've ever underwent. We came from a very peaceful sort of a home. Our father was Northern Italian. Our mother just lived for her husband and the children. It was a very happy household, but you could tell that there was something in the air. It was all hushed and quiet. You knew something was about to happen, like as if a bomb was about to explode. I know Mum and Dad used to go off and have a chat when it's 3 or 4 days when all this was happening, you know, and then they'd stop the conversation when you come into a room or something like that. Yes, you could tell something was about to happen.
I knew that one day, someday or other, something like that was going to happen, but I never ever thought that they'd do what they'd done, like burn places down. I mean, to have a street riot or something like that, but not to go and burn people's homes like that and leave men, women and children homeless.
Marinki Levis, son of a Yugoslav market gardener, and before him, Stella and Evelyn Vila, daughters of an Italian miner. I'm Bill Bunbury. The events which Stella, Evelyn and Marinki recalled were 4 days in January 1934, Australia Day weekend in the eastern goldfields of Western Australia. In the twin towns of Kalgoorlie and Boulder that weekend, and in the 2 days which followed, 3 men were killed, a number of hotels and shops destroyed, and almost an entire Italian Yugoslav community burnt out and looted. Why? Kalgoorlie in the 1930s was a magnet for both the unemployed of Australia and for migrants seeking to get on their feet in a new country. It was Depression time, but because of the corresponding rise in the value of gold, Kalgoorlie's mines were booming. Inevitably, migrants and Australian-born workers competed for jobs in a cheap labour market.
The foreigners just weren't liked in the place, you know what I mean? To see them days, work was hard to get. And there was a lot of talk, I reckon, that they were buying their jobs and all this sort of business. Like many Australian miners, they're looking for jobs and machines, and they wouldn't get them, yet they'd give them to foreigners, because, you know, the foreigners were pretty hard workers. There were a lot of Australian workers that work hard too, but for some reason or other, there was a hatred sort of feeling between them, you know, in any work. Doesn't matter where it was, underground, the mines, or where it was. If a foreigner was employed, they used to hate it.
Remember, this is Kalgoorlie at 34, in the midst of the Depression. The only place labour was in demand, and they poured in. Dislodged farmers' sons because the farmer was going broke. Dentists, public servants were up there chasing jobs.
And you could feel this undercurrent of hostility against the foreign element, particularly Italians and Slavs. And the main reason seemed to be sling back to the shift bosses, which gave them preferences in the workforce. On payday, they'd give the shift boss or the foreman £5, then they'd be given preferential jobs over an Australian miner.
I didn't blame the foreigners so very much then, and I still don't. I think the big fault lay with the shift bosses and the foremen who accepted those slingbacks and bribes. Mind you, I think I should make the point that not all Italians or Slavs were offering slingbacks and bribes.
But bribes and allegations of bribes apart, there were also the usual resentments and misunderstandings between different cultures.
Bunches of the Italian and Slavs used to get in the main street outside of hotels, and I've seen women had to walk out in the gutter to get around them, and they used to pass remarks in their own language and have a bit of a laugh so you can guess what they were talking about.
I'm glad you mentioned that. At that time, it is true that Italians, or Yugoslavs, whoever it may be, they'd stand in front of a hotel on a corner or in front of a club in a group, and many a time women with prams and they'd have to almost get off the footpath and go past them. If I happened to be about, I used to say to them, just move out the road, let those people through. That's how they used to get in groups and talk, you know. But they weren't talking about Australians. No, that's definitely wrong.
Yugoslav Marinki Levis, and before him, Australian Pud Man. Marinki Levis is a key witness in this story. He watched resentment and misunderstanding turn suddenly into violence and destruction in that Australia Day weekend. Saturday, January the 27th, was a typical hot summer day. Most people had been to the races or had been playing cricket. And that evening there was the odd pub brawl in one or another of Kalgoorlie's numerous hotels. But one fight in particular got nasty. It was between a popular sportsman, Edward Jordan, and an Italian barman, Claudio Mattaboni.
It was all over a schooner of beer, you know. This Jordan, you know, he was a very nice bloke, sober, and all the family, you know, they were a great mob of people. All the boys, you know, they all played sport and they were good footballers, all that. What happened, apparently this Jordan, he had enough, and he started to cause a bit of a nuisance of himself, and the barman told him he had enough.
There are conflicting accounts about what happened next, but the most reliable evidence suggests that Jordan brooded over being thrown out of the pub by Matabone and returned on the following evening, on Sunday, to get even with him. Marinki Levis witnessed the fight that followed.
I noticed this scuffle out in front of the hotel, so I just stopped right in front of the All Nations Hotel and watched it. I recognised this Charlie Matabone, you know. It looked like there was an argument there. This chap was arguing a point with this Charlie Matabone. Now he threw a punch at him, but missed him, but Matabone threw one at him and copped him, and he just fell backwards, you know, on his head, and he just lay there.
Jordan was dead. His fall to the pavement broke an unusually thin skull, and within hours of his death, rumours ran round Kalgoorlie Boulder like a fuse racing towards a charge of gelignite. All the long-held resentment of foreigners boiled over into fury at the death of a popular local identity. The riot and destruction which followed might not have happened if the facts had come out in time, but Jordan died while the local newspaper, the Kalgoorlie Miner, was still going to print, so there was no public explanation of the real cause of his death. And the long weekend meant that there was more time for rumours to spread and for hatred to build up. There were stories going around that Jordan had been knifed or stabbed by a bunch of Italians. What happened next, on the evening of Monday, January the 29th, is recalled by several witnesses.
We heard this roar of voices shouting out, and we wondered what on earth it was. We didn't know till next morning it was the riots.
My sister had been out during the day, and I think she had heard some talk of trouble in the town. And as the mob got to the nearby hotel, there was a noise of breaking bottles, shouting and screaming people. And my sister said, they are sacking the hotel. We went to the front of the house. Very soon flames started leaping from the hotel amid a lot of shouting and screeching. And while we watched, the people began to stream across to another hotel. The people in this hotel were very popular locally. We were appalled to see the breaking of bottles, furniture and furnishings being thrown over the balcony, and then, of course, the flames. From there, I think there were cars, which were not very numerous then, flying down the street with people singing and shouting, which, amid the trouble of those whose homes and hotels had been sacked, was rather appalling to the rest of us.
There was one particular, not a cafe, a milk bar we call them. This place was smashed to smithereens, and there was ice cream and fruit all out the front. And over the door was this caption. I'll always remember this. It was called the Green Heart, this milk bar, and it said, "Bring your sweetheart to the green bar." And this looked so futile to see this caption there.
As you see what they were doing, burning this down and burning this down, and filling up their shirts with grogs and cigarettes and crayfish and chooks and that from the fish shops and so forth. Really, it made you cry to see what was going on.
How they got organised, I'll never know, but they were all down there and they burnt that hotel down. They took kegs of beer out, spread the kegs of beer on the street corners in Hannon Street. You could see the empty kegs there. The next morning I went and saw these kegs on quite a few street corners. The drink was in then, and Hannon Street was just a shambles of broken glass and fruit and ice cream and furniture all over the place.
So the brother was attached to the Brown Hill Fire Brigade, and they were called out naturally. The alarm goes up the various volunteer fire brigades, and they went out with their machine down to the Home From Home hotel and were playing their hoses on the fire when all of a sudden they were just standing there with no water. The hoses had been cut with axes. That was the finish of the water system.
The whole thing happened so suddenly, there was absolutely no time at all for anybody to get organised against them. They were a terrific mob. I think any resistance to them by their own countrymen would have probably increased the trouble out of all knowledge.
A chap came up to me in Hannon Street and offered me 2 cutthroat razors for sale. Pinched out of a barber's shop, you see, that they'd smashed up.
I walked up the street with a couple of friends, and there was a Yugoslav named Mick Bullitt. He had a barber shop, and of course they broke the doors in there and filling up the shirts with cigarettes, hair oil, whatever they get hold of, and there was 2 detectives standing out the front, and I said to them, "What are you doing there, standing there? Why don't you stop this?" He says, "Listen, mate, if you want to go in there and get your head blown off, you go in." Well, you know, we walked in, and they all walked out. There'd be at least 10 or 12 of them in there, you know. So they just moved further up the street.
There was not enough policemen to control a rioting gang like that. That was impossible.
One of my brothers, I might tell you, my brothers were amongst the crowd, but one of them came home and he had a bottle of whiskey and one of those 3-cornered big heavy ashtrays. And my father was furious and he took them out onto the wood heap and he smashed them with the axe the bottle of whiskey and the ashtray, and he forbid my brother to leave the house. My dad told him, he said, you could go to jail for that. He said, can't you wake up to yourself?
The rioters were not only happy to burn the big hotels in Kalgoorlie and then to do the same in Boulder, but then they decided to participate in the destruction and the burning of the everyday families there, irrespective of whether they were Greek, Italian, German, Yugoslavs, whatever. They were all classified as dings, and their idea was to get rid of the Dagos. They didn't want a bar of them.
Evelyn Vila, whose own family was eventually forced to flee the town. On that same night, as Evelyn Vila recalls, the riots which began in Kalgoorlie spread down the Golden Mile to Boulder, and as in Kalgoorlie, some of the Boulder hotels were also Italian-owned and run.
Apparently the lady that owned this hotel, she was very worried that they were going to destroy her hotel. However, the Boulder police, they said, no, we will send 2 policemen out to watch the hotel. Well, they did. They sent a couple of policemen out. But as soon as those lorries came out, armed with the people that wanted a bit of excitement, those police had to get going because they couldn't hold them back. And, of course, they looted everything they could possibly loot from the hotel, threw it over the balconies, the lorries drove off, and then they just set fire to the whole place.
It was fairly daylight, and my mother had been very friendly with the licensee. She went up to her, and she saw her standing in the street, almost in tears, and gazing at the still smoking ruins of the hotel. And she just went up to her and put her arms around her. You could hardly tell a person, though, you were sorry that their home had been burnt down deliberately, could you? And she just said, well, she was so sorry. As Mrs. Furious said, I didn't think they'd do it. I didn't think they'd do it to me.
Tuesday morning, January the 30th.
The Italians and Slavs were making their plans. There was a lot of walking up and down in making their preparations. But to those they knew, we noticed that the men in passing were unfailingly polite.
All of a sudden, we got requests. I remember the people coming to the house with their tin trunks. They were mostly people that lived on the flats below our home, and they wanted for us to look after their belongings while they went to the bush and got away from this atmosphere and these things that were happening.
Well, all those that were naturalised Australians were coming in with their naturalisation papers and standing up, big men, standing up and crying, and didn't know what was going on because they said they were Australians.
The people that had their houses wrecked and so forth, they had pretty good friends among the Australians, and they took them home. In a lot of cases, took them home and looked after them until they got somewhere to live. Some of them lived in their friends' places for some time.
There's one chap, he lived in what we called a camp at the back of our place, and he got underneath his house scared, and then he heard someone saying about being burnt, and he was frightened he'd get burnt to death, so he apparently ran into our place. Actually, I don't know who it was that found him because there were so many men that had come to protect our home, but they found him under my mother's bed, scared stiff. But before the rioters came over, we children were sent away with our uncle. They had a car there ready to take us away. My mother stayed. Oh, it was some time afterwards someone said, well, you've got to go, like someone took her away. But there was 2 Slav men stood one each end of our front veranda near the shop and said, don't you worry, missus, they'll kill us before they touch your place.
I was at this meeting with a couple of friends, and all of a sudden there was a sound of small arms fire and then gelignite bombs going off.
It was dreadful. I was terrified because there were people kept saying that they were going to burn all the managers' homes down, they were going to do this, a terrible mob talk. And we could hear bombs going off in the town. And all round there was a ring of fire. You could see, and I was terrified. I thought the whole world looked to be on fire.
There was a place to the east of the railway lines called Dingbat Flat. The Anglo-Saxons, they were one side, the Yugoslavs, Italians, whatever, were across the other side, because a terrible lot of those people had their homes on that side of the railway track.
They were filter press 2-room huts, you could call them, they were built off. Some had a side veranda on, they were comfortable home. To them, that was home. And there were many of them in that area, and they just went through and burnt them down, and firing started. They even, as I said, got in trenches and were firing at one another. It was rather severe.
I don't know how much gelignite they heard, but I heard a lot of jammed-in bombs going off. with nuts and bolts and gravel flying around, I suppose, as opposed to the small arms fire. As a matter of fact, the aggressors, the fellows with the small arms, they daren't venture across that water ditch until there was dead silence, and then they rushed in and set alight to their homes.
They went out there and they raided this place. They hunted all the women and children out, who more or less took to the bush for protection, and they razed the place to the ground. You could see burnt out frames of sewing machines and wirelesses. It was a sorry sight.
These women, you know, they were all in black, every one of them, and they were just, you know, with their hands clasped, looking up,
in
walking
prayer,
down, and crying, the tears running down their faces, little children hanging onto their skirts. At that time, I just said a short prayer that God would end it soon, that it would stop, because it was terrifying.
My brother happened to be there when the Stokesy got his stomach ripped open. My brother helped him, plus a couple of other mates, down to the doctors, but he was dead then. And at the same time, there was a Yugoslav shot. He was dead also.
Wednesday morning, January the 31st. There was now a large number of homeless families, their houses destroyed by fire and in some cases looted.
The next day, most of the people in the district offered to help them, in that they were welcome to come and stay with them. And I think probably it was more after the following day, when the area across the railway line had been burnt out, that they were rather independent. They'd accept help in the offer of food, supplies or some clothing. That as the trouble went on the second and third day, they had organised themselves.
A lot of them had come out from Boulder. See, they were frightened because they knew what would be going on. Just nowhere to go, just walking up and down, up and down. They were terrified.
A lot of them took to the bush.
Yes.
They were days out there before they recovered them, some of them.
And out there, they threw what they didn't burn up. They threw down the old dumps of their furniture. They were left with nothing.
Well, I think the most vivid memory really is to see the people that were really in trouble, the Slavs or the Italians, going out to the bush of a night time with their families, scared stiff to stay in their own homes, or those that had their homes still. They talk about refugees in other countries. And what is this?
Now, when that young fellow was killed, that sent them out for more blood. Private houses. So when we knew that was imminent, and Dad was very worried at the time, he said, well, we've got Italians across the road and one a few doors down on the other corner, and he said, well, we'll leave. So the neighbours were very good. Actually, they were all Australian neighbours apart from the one across the road. They shifted any furniture of value out of our homes, put it in different homes. They refuelled the car and we set sail. And right along the road from Kalgoorlie, almost further than Kalgoorlie, which is a long way, almost to Southern Cross, there were people walking like so many refugees with their bundles on their backs. Little children walking along with their mothers, you know, holding their hands, and it was pretty grim.
Those that were walking close enough to our home, my mum would stop and ask them would they like a cup of tea or something like that. She took pity on them too. Well, they didn't want to talk because they were in a lot of shock and very upset. They couldn't talk really, poor things.
But during that day, I don't know how many people, you know, shifted furniture and took their families. We had about 200 down our market garden. I used to cart water out to them, and they were out there for at least a week. They just lived out in the open, and some days when I'd go out there with water to see this dust, and they were scared, thinking that they might be coming out there, but it was only me going out taking vegetables and bread, you know.
The Red Cross went out the next morning and took food and water out to them, but they just ran away again and went further into the bush, which wasn't very dense anyhow.
Well, they thought they were going to kill them all, you know what I mean? That's what was in their head. Matter of fact, if you speak to some of the oldies that are still left, someone's only going to mention it. And it upsets him to see some of the old ladies cry, to think what they lost. You know, they had a beautiful home, all nicely furnished and everything like that, and they just lost everything.
The men stayed behind mainly because there was this idea, well, it wasn't an idea, it was a fact that they were going to burn the BASs out. And I suppose the men stayed behind to try to protect their homes. They had worked, and a lot of them had been on that goldfields for years and years and years. I mean, I'm not quite sure how long my dad had been out from Italy, but I should imagine it would be quite a number of years, and you don't like to see everything you possess go up in smoke in a matter of 5 minutes because somebody has got a grudge against somebody that is the same nationality as yourself.
A trainload of police specials arrived in Kalgoorlie the next day, Thursday, to quell any further disorder, but they were scarcely needed. By then the fury had been spent. The miners who'd been on strike since Tuesday went back to work. The state government rebuilt houses for those who had lost them, and many of the rioters were prosecuted for damage and looting. But the Italians and Slavs had borne the brunt of 4 days of devastation. What was their future in Kalgoorlie? Some left and never returned. But for the majority, there was no choice but to remain and make the best of it.
Their homes were here, they had their work here, and really had nowhere else to go.
The only life they knew, the only thing they knew how to do was to mine, to go down in the mines and earn a living. They couldn't pick up the tools and start afresh anywhere else. It was impossible to do that.
Oh, there was a great deal of bitterness. I was working underground at the time. The Australians, Italians and Slavs were mixed workforce underground. Things were very unhappy for quite a while. The mine staff did the very best to segregate the Australians from the Southern Europeans. Things were a bit sticky for a while.
Well, they kept it to themselves. They did nothing about it. They went back to work after the mass meeting. And it's a strange thing, really. You see, you could hardly believe that this terrible happening was going to take place, because down the mines where I'd worked quite a bit, there was Pete and Nick and so on. You worked with them, you're good friends, back chat and so on. But they went back to work.
They went back and started life all over again. And there was the Australians there, or Anglo-Saxons, whichever you like to call them, that they were appalled at the situation, that it could have got out of hand as much as all that.
There's goods and 3 men dead, countless property destroyed, and just for no purpose whatever.
I don't think it was hatred, it was just alcohol. Some of the places they burned down was they used to work with the chaps underground.
A lot of them felt very, very sorry for themselves, you know what I mean, because they know the harm they caused and the damage they caused. A lot of that was stirred up early in the day by drinking into it, you know.
Children accept things such as births and deaths more than grown-ups and things like that, and you learn to accept these things, I suppose, as everyday things. I was devastated to think that people who call themselves human beings could act so unkind towards other human beings who hadn't done anything wrong.
It was a terrible business. I say it's Australia's day of shame, well, certainly WA's and Kalgoorlie's day of shame.
Most of them felt guilty over the whole business. Most of the people I worked with, I met with, talked with, a bad blue, that was the general opinion, a bad blue.
In A Bad Blue, the Kalgoorlie Riots of 1934, I was talking with Stella and Evelyn Vila, Marinki Levis, Patience and Stanley Davidson, Jack and Nancy Crisp, Marjorie Henderson, Ernest Fraser, Beatrice Wellington, Barry Bracegirdle, Vera and Pud Mann, Eddie Stephen, Lionel Hitchcock, Cora Sudlow, Bronk Finlay and Jack Coleman. Research assistance was from Norma King, and studio production Jenny Mason, Bill Atkinson and Tony Popel. I'm Bill Bunbury.